Postcards from a Dying World, the podcast. For more than a decade, I've reviewed over 1,000 books that are mostly science fiction, horror, and bizarro. This feed will feature bonus audio I have produced over the years, as well as a monthly digest of reviews based on what I've read each month, plus the occasional bonus material about my own fiction. Thanks for listening.
Hello and welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. I'm very excited to have the author of one of the most notorious releases of the year in horror fiction, Manhunt, by Gretchen Martin. It's Gretchen Felker-Martin, right?
Felker.
Martin. Gosh, I'm already off to a bad start. But Manhunt is one of the biggest releases of the year. It's causing a lot of controversy, and we're going to get into it because I really love the book. But as we always do, we're going to start off with your horror origin story. How did you get into horror fiction? And before we get into the writing, just getting into horror, how did that happen?
Well, when I was a kid, every time that I would get scared by something, I would want to experience it again and again. I was not a roller coaster fan, but what I really loved was being alone in the woods at night and pushing myself to stay out as long as I could in the dark. I grew up in a town of 600 people. That's almost the whole town area is old growth forest.
And what state was that?
New Hampshire.
New Hampshire. Oh, okay. Yeah. I've driven through New Hampshire, spent a little time there, but yeah, I can see
spooky.
I can see that there would be spooky times in New Hampshire.
I was a big fan of being scared by movies. I watched Alien and Jurassic Park. That kitchen scene imprinted on me very young. Those were things that I would hide behind the couch while they were on, but I would want to watch them again and again and again. Those things it was just always where I wanted to be.
Right. And the fun thing for horror fans, growing up, is that there's no shortage of material or things to get into. Were you a reader early on? Or was it more movies with horror?
I actually struggled to learn to read. I could not read pretty much at all until I was about 10. But once I had it, I was immediately into Stephen King and anything else I could get my hands on.
Right. Well, you're speaking with a writer with dyslexia, so I know we're a lot of writers there are a lot of writers with learning disabilities, because I feel like that challenge that we have to overcome is a lot of times why we take it seriously, right?
Yeah, well, it has always been something that I attached a lot of emotional significance to. And once I got done crying from sheer frustration over it every single day of my life, all of that emotion was still there, but I was able to refashion my relationship to it.
Right. And for writing, when did writing come into this? Because I think for a lot of us, when we first get into horror fiction, we so enjoy being scared that we want to make these things. We want to have that same impact on other people. Did you have certain horror fiction that really spoke to you as far as wanting to be a creator?
I don't know if there was, not in my younger life, but certainly reading it at the same time, at the same age as the kids in the book. So when I was 11 or 12, that was really significant to me, and has stuck with me through my whole life. I would say that if there's a book that made me want to write horror, it's probably Julia Graffer's Palm Ash, which is a mini zine about a Christian martyr being held prisoner as the Romans prepare to feed him to lions.
Interesting. I have never heard of that. Well, most times when I ask people, what was their real big inspiration, I usually know it. And that's one that I don't know, which is cool. I have to look into that. But you were a Stephen King reader. Were you into Clive Barker, a little deeper, Poppy Bright, those kinds of things, or like?
I only read Poppy Bright very recently. I appreciate what he's doing, but it's not really my kind of horror.
Mm,
Um, as a kid, I was very into Barker, especially like as a little closeted weirdo. Um, I was very into King. I loved Shirley Jackson. Uh, I was a huge, huge fan of the Yellow Wallpaper. What else did I like as a kid? I
well,
mean,
hey,
I loved Goosebumps.
no, that's really important transitional stuff, I think, for a lot of us.
Yeah,
Yeah, I definitely see the Barker influence, and especially in the characters, I see the King influence for sure. And we'll get into that when we get more into the writing of Manhunt. But so, how did you get serious about writing? Did you start with short stories, that kind of thing, or because I know your film criticism is where you've cut a lot of your teeth, right?
yeah, yeah. That's where I got started as a professional writer. Um, I would say that I got serious about horror writing when I actually wound up befriending Julia Graffer, the author I just told you about a minute ago.
Hmm.
I reviewed one of her books, Dark Age, and we struck up a friendship afterwards and have become really close. And we would talk a lot about self-publishing and independent horror and just sort of how important we felt it was to experience discomfort and to intentionally inflict discomfort on yourself so that you could understand what was causing it and what it meant or didn't mean. Um, and so I decided that I wanted to do this. You know, as this person I really admired doing this work that I loved, that resonated really deeply with me. And that was when I wrote my first novella, No End Will Be Found, which is about a young woman who is accused of witchcraft during the witch craze in Würzburg, Germany in the 17th century.
Hmm. Wow, that sounds cool. Now, that had to be a lot of research for a first piece, right?
Yeah, it was a ton of work. I just slogged my way through the entire Malleus Maleficarum, which is like a witch finder's handbook from the period. I read a bunch of old court transcripts, which are just both the bleakest and the most boring things you can imagine.
Right.
My historical horror has always been like very intensely researched, although I don't care terribly about historical accuracy, you know, whether or not everyone is wearing the right kind of lederhosen or whatever. That stuff doesn't matter to me, because no matter how hard you try and produce a simulacra of the past, it's going to be so immediately and obviously wrong to anyone who has seen the real thing. You know, you take someone from the time period and you show them say a tavern that you've labored to reproduce in perfect historical detail, and right away they'll be like, well, this is fucked up. Where's the guy who polishes everyone's hat?
Yeah.
There's
Right.
all these things that just disappear down the well of time that we'll never get back.
Yeah, we were just having that problem with. We were watching a show from the '80s a couple weeks ago, and like young writers always have people saying like "you got this" and stuff like that that nobody said back then,
Right.
but are commonplace now. And so if you lived there, of course, younger writers they don't know the people that weren't saying that yet. So yeah, I like what you're saying about historical accuracy, and I sorry to say I haven't read your historical horror yet. I'm excited to dive into that because I think I do really love historically themed horror fiction. It's funny, I like it more in prose than I do in film. Like a lot of times I get bored by it in film, but
Mm.
so what's the? Do you have a big interest in history? Is that where that came from, or?
Yeah, actually, in college I studied the infrastructural effects of the Black Plague on England.
Wow.
Um,
That must have been
Yeah.
fascinating.
It's incredibly fascinating. Just like the enormous logistical challenge of having, in many cases, more bodies than living people is so overwhelming. It completely changed the way the whole country operated. And there's also nothing as chilling as taking these transcripts from clerks in the 14th century and literally seeing the handwriting change from line to line because they are dying.
Oh, wow. Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah,
Well, and I bet that, now we'll get back to this, but I bet that had an influence on this pandemic novel that you just released
certainly. Yeah.
in ways that a lot of people probably would not catch. But knowing that that's something that you've researched, now I can see it. And you know that historical perspective really gives you a good idea for how to look at because I think what's going to be underrated in the controversy of all this, because everyone's going to be focusing on J.K. Rowling burning or whatever, but if they really look at what's going on in this novel, you can see that touch of that historical researcher in you for setting this all up, and we'll drill down on that in a bit. But and I admit, Manhunt is the first of your work that I've read. I since this book got announced, I've been following you on Twitter, and I really enjoy following you on Twitter, and I was really excited for this book. And I'm gonna dig deeper because once I find an author I like, I'm gonna read everything eventually. But Manhunt is very specifically is a really interesting shot across the bow to really announce yourself to the world. We know that you've done other work and that you've done other things and you've done the film criticism, but this is the type of book that makes people think like this is the beginning, right? So it's a really
Right. It's my mainstream debut.
it's your mainstream debut, and believe me, as somebody who publishes indie, like I'm not poo-pooing that, but it's a major thing. So um, thinking about like having a book that's going to be such a awesome middle finger, but a middle finger. You had to think about that before submitting. Did you submit based on had you already written this before you submitted it to Tor?
I actually didn't submit it to Tor.
Interesting.
My agent Connor Goldsmith saw an excerpt that I had posted online on my own Patreon, and he got in touch with me and asked me if I was interested in representation. So I agreed to sign with him, and then he sold it to Tor, and he actually sold it on spec, which was very exciting. I think there were only about 10,000 words written at that point.
Wow. See, that's what I was wondering because I had a feeling that, or I was just wondering that they were totally on board with this concept before you even like had totally completed it, right?
Yeah, they were.
That is awesome.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have a really um, fantastic agent, Kelly O'Connor Lonesome,
Mm. And
or
so
editor. Sorry.
yeah. And so that's cool because it seems like you got a lot of people in your corner for this book from the beginning, and
Yeah,
that's meaningful when you're doing a book like this. So you had to know, even when you're putting out on your Patreon that this first chapter, that that you're stepping into pretty controversial waters as far as a horror fiction novel. Now, so you knew what you were doing, right, with this?
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, which is cool. So let's talk about the Tiptree, the Sleeping Beauties, the why, the last man of it all, because I think it's important. As a genre, the gender specific genre. One of the reasons why I was so excited about this book is because I was already annoyed with this genre and wanted a middle finger uh, book in that regard. Because as much as I liked Why the Last Man when I read it, however long ago when it came out, and I love the Screwfly solution, and I'm a huge Alice Sheldon fan in general.
Me too.
Um, but and I love Stephen King as a person more than than a writer, actually. But Sleeping Beauties was awful for a couple things. And
Yes.
specifically, the gender roles in it were ridiculously terrible and old
I thought it
fashioned.
was a very weak book.
Yeah. And so I felt like, in a lot of ways, this book, because we had these gender specific novels, and Tiptree was doing this, in the 70s, so that was a long time ago, and our idea and understanding of gender spectrum was just not there yet.
Mhm.
And so it's understandable. But when these books are coming out now, that's different. And so you obviously were like wanting to play with the idea of the gender apocalypse in this from a trans perspective. And how long ago did the seed of this idea come, and how did it develop?
I
That's
believe
a
it
lot
was
of
in.
talking. I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. I think I started work on it and had the idea for it in 2019 after my good friend Alice Storr, who's also trans, read the Screwfly solution out loud to me while we were just hanging out. Alice really likes to read aloud, and it had been so long since I had read it, and I was so struck not just by how good it is and how insightful it is, but by how much goes unsaid in this world and
Yes.
unanswered. And
Yeah.
I don't think that's a weakness of the story. The story is about something very specific, and it's extremely thoughtful about what it is about. But there's all this undiscovered territory in the back of it. All of this world of people who are not suburbanites and who do not fit neatly into the two molds that society talks about having. Um, and I felt really strongly that this was something that I could do, that I could pull something really interesting out of that negative space.
Right. And you certainly did.
Thank you.
Now, as far as one of the things that makes Tiptree, I think, different, and Screwfly solution, Alice Sheldon, that whole thing is just what an interesting life she led and how many struggles she had. So that bleeds through the work. And I think one of the things that is really great about Manhunt, as well as is that the there's a very personal nature to it, and as far as that makes the characters, which who are obviously there's a very diverse cast of characters in Manhunt, but their struggles feel deeper, right? And it's funny because that you mentioned that, because I think one of the things that makes it similar to Screwfly Solution is less the gender like storylines, obviously, but a lot of it is that the characters have such deep um, meaning and metaphor to what's going on of the whole. Okay, so that's one of the things that I think is the connection. So tell me about developing the characters. How early was that in the process?
That
Of
was pretty immediate. I would say I had the whole main cast within the first few days.
Mhm.
And really, there are reflections of myself, they're reflections of the people around me, people that I love and who piss me off and who I find charming and obnoxious. And of course, these are all the same people and all these categories overlap. What I really wanted to do was to do justice to queer people and a whole world and community of queer people as complicated and self-contradictory and occasionally deeply, deeply ugly and transcendentally loving and brave.
That's awesome, and we'll get back. We'll break down character by character a little bit later, but I want to talk about. So then you write this novel. You had the support of editors and agents that they had bought on spec this, but you had to sit down and deliver. Were you nervous once you started getting into like uh, actually doing it? Like, because I could see where that might be, because it's one thing to buy the pitch, and then it's another thing to write this kind of story, right?
Well, part of me was nervous. I had never worked with an editor before. I had never had representation before, and it was intimidating to be on this larger stage with a larger prospective audience who would see this thing that I was doing that I knew many people would find extremely objectionable.
Mm-hmm.
And that is an experience I had on a small scale with my own self-published work, which is very dark and deals with a lot of very, very ugly things. People get mad. They do not have the necessary art literacy and social skills to look at something, think that's not really for me, and move on with their life.
Right.
I think I was more scared of that than I was of anything with my publisher, because if my publisher told me that they weren't going to publish it, I would just quit.
Right. Well, it's obvious that they supported you
Yeah.
on this, and that they had to know there were going to be battle lines, and they had to have been ready to back you.
Oh, my agent and I got on the phone with a couple of people over at Nightfire when they said that they wanted to hire me. And we said, listen, the minute you announce this, there are going to be people, the craziest people you've ever met, screaming at you about it. And it probably will not ever fully calm down, and it might get a lot worse. And that bore out. The moment that Tor announced, there were people calling them, trying to get me fired. I've experienced public harassment and mobbing for years and years now. It's nothing new.
Right. Well, that's too bad, and I hate it. But at the same time, I really appreciate that your publisher stuck by you. Now, do you think, and this is an interesting question, do you think it was worse when the announcement was made or when the book actually came out? Because that, to me, I'm curious about.
Well, I think almost no one who's enraged by the book has read it or will read it.
Right.
Just really a tiny handful of people who are sort of repulsed by me on an identitarian level or ideological have picked it up at all. But it has been worse since it's come out and since the book's profile has grown. Recently, it has been an international tabloid sensation, which was extremely irritating and exhausting.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because, like I've had a couple of my books published by Deadite, and when Jeff would always say to me behind the scenes, he's like, if you're really lucky, people will hate your book and want to destroy you. Right? And
Right.
then he would always talk about how like he was looking for controversy with a lot of things, and I kept telling him like, well, there's a be careful what you wish for thing, because it helps the book sales, but at the same time you got to deal with it as a human being.
Right.
And so as somebody who's supportive of the book and thinks those assholes should go fuck off, you know, I see both sides, because there's a part of me that's like, every book should get somebody to hate it so much that they increase the bandwidth. You know, that's a fun thing. But at the same time, I'm sorry you have to deal with that as a human being, because I know, specifically because of what your book is about, the people who hate it are particularly gross. Right?
Thank you. And it's certainly, some of it is unpleasant. I've gotten very good at dealing with it over the years, and I'm at a point in my life where really the worst it gets is just that I'm tired of it.
Right, right. Yeah,
I
get
really
that.
appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. As a thick-skinned person myself, I understand that. I just I think it's too bad that you have to deal with it. But that being said, you're right. It has turned into an international tabloid thing, and that's an unfortunate thing because most of the tabloid headlines are like J.K. Rowling burns alive in the book, and it's like seriously like a couple lines that are pretty hilarious.
Man, I
And
wish I'd burned her alive in the book at this point. I might as well have.
yeah, because you didn't really do that. It's funny because in a lot of these other in the road, J.K. Rowling died, right? But just because it wasn't talked about, and at this, so the controversy's silly, but at the same time, we're dealing with it here, and that's unfortunate. But let's focus on the book, though. Let's not
Sounds
talk
good to
about
me.
that anymore. Now, I admit, when you said earlier you were talking about Puppy Brighton, you said not my kind of horror, that kind of thing. Usually, extreme horror is not my kind of horror either, right? I am not. It's funny to say this as somebody who's been nominated for a Splatterpunk Award, and I have, but I'm not a big extreme horror person. Like, I really don't like reading Ed Lee, for example, because I feel like even when he tries to be feminist, it comes off sounding terrible. And I know he's like a nice guy and everything. I'm just saying like how it comes off to me. And so when you refer to yourself in the acknowledgments as writing gross splattercore, I thought to myself, if somebody had told me read this book, it's gross splattercore, I would have been like, yeah, no thanks. That's not my kind of thing, right? And extreme horror, I had to know, has a history of being very political. And, I've had several books published with Deadites, so, like, I have a connection to extreme horror, but it's just not my thing, generally. So what's really interesting to me is that doesn't matter to me in my reading of this book. I enjoyed it. And it's because it's not to say that every extreme horror doesn't work for me. But I wouldn't have classified this book as gross splattercore. I mean, there's a few really gory parts, but where does that name connect to your work in your mind? Or were you just basically taking the piss out of yourself?
Well, my agent is the one who handed me the Splatterpunk label. It's not something I had ever really thought about.
You're getting nominated for that award, Gretchen. Let me tell you. If you don't win it, I'd be really shocked, but you're definitely getting nominated.
That's very flattering. Thank you. But it wasn't really a term I was terribly familiar with. I mean, I'd heard it, I knew what it meant, but it's not something I think about when I think about what movie I want to sit down and watch or what book I want to read. I do like extreme horror. I'm a big fan of Ken Russell's The Devils, of Andrzej Zulawski's Possession, of things like Cello and The Night Porter. I love stories about human emotion at the outer limits of extremity, and for the body too. I'm a big fan of Wolf Creek and The Loved Ones, and movies that a lot of people would call torture porn. But
you're mentioning stuff that I like, so it's funny because, I say that, but it's just a taste thing, I guess. But
I do think that, of course, there are many entries in these genres that are totally tasteless and hollow, and I have no interest in them. But I think that's true for basically everything.
True.
And I'm just as big a fan of The Haunting of Hill House and The Bloody Chamber and all of these other sort of more restrained and traditional modes of telling horror stories. But as to where I see myself and Manhunt in relation to that, I think that Manhunt is a little punk as a book. It's probably the least disgusting thing I've ever written.
Interesting.
I may have pulled back on the throttle a little bit unconsciously. My historical fiction is much, much grosser. It involves like a lot of torture. Um, I would say that I don't object to Manhunt being called splatterpunk.
Mm.
It's certainly got kind of that what's that genre in Japanese movies? Girl boss, I think, is the rough translation of, women with bandages across the bridge of their noses beating people up with baseball bats. It's got a little bit of that.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
it's a great, and I say this with all love and respect, it's a great middle finger novel because I
Thank you.
love middle finger novels. And I think when an author can really just let it fly and do it in a really classy way, it's great. And so it's funny that you said I kind of wish I had burned J.K. Rowling alive because you're getting credit for doing it whether you liked it or not, right?
Right.
And but what about living up to the buzz? Because you were still working on finishing the book when all the anger and the vitriol and the oh holy fuck I can't wait for this from the people who knew who were going to be like me who were just like holy shit that's going to be incredible like like you had to kind of live up to that was so was that a concern when you were writing it or did you know you had it?
I mean, I
It's
write for
fine to
me.
know that.
I write for me, and sometimes part of that is talking to certain subsets of my readership, but ultimately it's just not something I worried about. If people liked it, they liked it, and if they didn't, that's not my problem.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand that, But it had to be interesting because I mean, they were talking a lot of people were talking about this book, before it came, especially with the cover.
Yeah, the buzz was really lovely to have, and I'm thrilled to have apparently met people's expectations.
Oh, certainly. Yeah. I think for most readers who were looking forward to it, who are not in the hater crowd, we're all feeling that way. Now, what about the cover? Like, what was the discussion with the cover? Was that something that was brought to you, or did you have that idea from the beginning?
Um, no, my ideas for the cover were very different. Um, the design team at Tor came up with this, and it's amazing. I'm so glad we went with it. And they were able to get Sarah Sitkin, who did a lot of the monster design for Channel Zero, to come over and sculpt this for us. And just like, I've never shown anyone this cover without seeing them flinch or bare their teeth, or it's such a great little Rorschach test.
Well, I'll tell you a story of when I was reading it. I had the book on my desk at work, and it was after the kids left, but because I'm a teacher for my day job, and one of the other teachers who's an absolute bro dog, total normal guy, flipped out when he saw the cover, had to take a picture of it, and was like, not he's not a reader, and he was like, oh, dude, you got to tell me about this book. What the hell's going on with this book? And it was so funny because he's not a reader, and he's like, man, I hope they make a movie of it someday. And I'm like, why don't you just learn to read a book, you know? But it was hilarious because I don't know what he did with it, but he took a picture of it, because he was
It's so
just,
funny.
yeah. And, that's just, I think this cover is so evocative and it just works at so many levels and it just, you know, yeah, the design is great. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, and it was sculpted, huh? It was like,
Yeah, it's a photograph of a sculpture.
that is so cool.
Yeah, it really is.
So, so the controversial part of the controversial thing or the thing, and I admit, this was the thing that and I had written you about was the eating of the balls because the eating of the testicles was a thing that I felt like I was trying to read too much into it, and I was like, I didn't realize that they produced estrogen, which is like
They do,
unfortunate.
yeah.
Yep, which is I assumed that's what was going on, but the first person I mentioned to when somebody asked me what I was reading, they questioned me on that, and they were ones that screwed me up, and they were like, I don't think testicles create estrogen. And I was like, yeah, I think they do. I think that's why they're eating them. And then that's why I ended up writing you, because I let somebody question that for me. But what's interesting is that, and this is an effect of your book, is that I had a whole conversation at work with somebody about eating testicles. And
Nothing
whether
I've
there
ever
was
seen
estrogen or
in the
not in
world.
testicles because of your book. So, conversation starter. But where did this part of the story come from? Was that early on? Was that in that first sample chapter? That
Yeah, it was. It was one of the first things that I thought of. I thought it was just really nasty and icky and would get readers immediately invested.
right. Well, and I've said, and I was clear about this in my review, the part where I believe it's Fran, I could be getting the characters mixed up, but the paragraph, I was so close, she thought miserably, sitting down to a candlelight dining room table, where on her plate an 8-inch cock sat crisped up beautifully under a thin drizzle of vinaigrette reduction. I was so close to being a girl. That to me, I always look for in books lines or parts that are mission statements. And for me, that line was, if you get the balance of emotion and viscera in one paragraph and you can handle it, this book is going to work for you, right? And so to me, that line was, and I do this with every author I have on, is talk about the mission statement. To me, that was, as a reader, that was what I took as a mission statement. How do you feel about that?
I think it's a perfectly valid way to read that line. That's Fran grappling with the way that the world has changed and hasn't changed for her. It's sort of, by extension, the long knockdown, drag out fight that almost all trans women go through with their appearance and their relationship to surgery and the entire sort of nebulous process of transition. And I do think that is at the heart of the book. It's like, what is this experience, and what does it mean, and what doesn't it mean, and how does it change you, and how doesn't it?
And it's so important because if a gender specific pandemic happens at this time,
Mhm.
it would be particularly heartbreaking for a person at that space in their life at that time. And it says so much about the character and sets the stage for not not just the violence of the story, but the emotions of the story and the characters. And we'll get more into that soon here with characters. But I want to talk about the TERFs as villains because, and for people who don't know, TERF stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminists. And, a really important stage for me in my writing, and, speaking of somebody who's like a radical environmentalist and a militant vegan, and I wrote a story about that originally when I started it was an anti-logging story with a character in a tree sit. And it was really important to me, evolution of my writing, because I made a character out of one of the loggers and really got into the head of the people on the other side of the tree sit, which, I had organized tree sits in my life. I had fought against them, but actually writing the character who was a logger made my fiction so much richer and deeper, because even though I didn't agree with his position, this character, I had to think about it a lot. So I think a lot about Ramona as a character and the TERFs here, because I'll admit, when I was going into this book, one thing I was a little worried about was, will the TERFs be cartoony to the point where no one can understand their position? Like, obviously, they are the villains of the piece. They are. They're very clearly the villains. But Ramona's a character that I feel like I understood. And I thought that added so much dimension to Manhunt. And I think some people will overlook that. But Ramona was a very important character. Can you tell me about writing this character?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that Ramona is the linchpin of the novel in a lot of ways. She deepens and complicates the conflict around pretty much every major plot point in the book. And I would say that her emotional journey is probably the most fraught of anyone's. Um, not not to say that it's the hardest or the most unique or whatever, but just that it's incredibly complicated. Um, and by contrast with the things she's going through, I think Ramona is someone who is reflexively, almost defensively simple about how she interacts with the world around her. She plays stupid a lot. She's very sort of what I would call morally lazy, in that she sort of takes the shape of whatever society is around her. Um, and she does things mostly because they're easy or expected of her.
Yeah. Now, when critics of this book from the turf community, do they? That's one thing where I say to myself, I think there's no way they've actually read the book, because I think you gave them more of a voice than most people would ever expect, on the outside. And I think, like I said, I think that it's important to because a lot of people, like, sometimes with conversation, it's one of the reasons why I brought up that story about the logger, is like, you can't begin to have dialogue if people can't start to understand where each other's coming from, even if you vehemently disagree, right?
Well, I think that you do have a point. I would like to state for the record, I have no interest whatsoever in facilitating or approaching any dialogue with TERFs. They're exterminationists,
Totally understood.
and I don't believe we have anything to gain from any political approach except shaming them out of existence.
Sure. But at the same time, Ramona is a character that has depth,
Yeah,
and
and
yeah,
dramatically, that's very important
sure,
in
gotcha.
the construction of a story. I've said this before. I think if anything, I was perhaps too generous to the TERFs in this book, because when you listen to real TERFs, they're insane. Their brains have been completely parboiled. I have never heard or read anything made by one of them that approached coherence.
Yeah,
And not only that, but it's all they do, just day in and day out, spending a whole life hating people who don't want anything to do with you and are never going to matter to your life.
right. Well,
Um,
and I think, if anything, that's one of the reasons why I think that a lot of these critics are not they're not actually checking out the book. They're not actually seeing what you're saying,
yeah, I agree. I've certainly seen many criticisms from people who very obviously haven't read the book. I have seen some even more disturbing criticisms from people who have and who identify strongly with Ramona and with the women around her, and say that I've created this narrative that twists the fact that these are the heroes.
That is crazy.
It's pretty wild to see actually written out directly.
What? Oh man. Well, of course. I mean, you can't control that. A lot of times, you can write, there, Nazis all like take books all the time that shouldn't
Nazis
be.
love American History X.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, as I always say when this comes up, there are people who went to war because of Full Metal Jacket. You cannot make idiot-proof fiction.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I had that situation with my Boot Boys of the Wolf Reich, which is anti-Nazi skinheads and werewolves, and I randomly I had at one point a guy who was a Nazi skinhead write me and tell me that he really liked the book, and I was like, how on earth did you like this book? Like, beyond the fact that I'm Jewish and that all the heroes are clearly the anti-racists, it's just flabbergasting when that happens.
Foolish.
Yeah, it's foolish, it's weird, and okay. So, but I do want to say that I really appreciated how Ramona was written as a character, and in just how because I think a lot of times too people forget that villains um, have to be the heroes of their own story, whether you like it
Right.
or
These
not.
are these are people.
Yeah, yeah, and it makes the book richer and more like if characters are too mustache twirly, it gets.
Yeah, that's not something I'm very interested in writing. Um, I'm most interested in why people who are understandable, who are like us in many ways, would do something that is so unbelievably horrific. And of course, we can see examples of the same thing happening all around us every day. We are all surrounded by people who are police officers, who volunteer for the United States Army, who participated without complaint in the banning and detention of like Arab and Syrian and Lebanese travelers to and from America, who work in border camps where people are kept in detention under inhumane conditions indefinitely. Prison guards. I mean, it's everywhere. The whole society, the entirety of American society is built on this bedrock of chattel slavery and then fascism.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And if we don't understand these characters, what are we doing? But so speaking of the characters, when I sat down to write these questions for the interview, and I was, I like to get nitty gritty about like the writing of these books and get underneath the hood. And it's funny because the first thing I did was write down the characters' names and say, because I wanted to talk about them based on characters. Because one thing I think is underrated about this book that was very clear to me from the beginning or from reading it is that the characters are so fundamental to how the book um, how the book how my reaction to the book and what I felt about it. Fran, Beth, and Robbie are, and I want to talk about how each one was developed because I think that says so much about where the book goes. I think it's a very character driven book, and not very many people are going to say that, but I am. I think it's a very character driven book.
I agree with you.
Yeah, and
I'm I don't like plot.
okay. Well, look, I am a plotter, but and I will admit that. But in this particular book, but I not for me, I am. For other people, I can read everything. Now, Fran, let's talk about Fran. Where does this character come from, and how does she relate to the overall theme of the book, in your opinion?
Well, Fran comes from a diverse number of sources. One is the many slender, beautiful, and fairly easy to pass trans women who are in my life or who are tangential to my life and who behave in a variety of ways, ranging from kind of oblivious and lacking in solidarity to really true blue, wonderful women. Um, she's also drawn from the many, many, many Jewish friends that I have had um, and still have and treasure. It's 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 very important to me to talk about Judaism in American fiction, to try to honor the things that Jewish people and Jewish families have given to me. And I think it's a pretty ineradicable part of Fran. And it's also connected to her deep ambivalence about who she is and where she wants to fall along cultural lines, because of course she has this enormous, extremely understandable desire to go through extensive body modification, but at the same time, the culture that she comes from considers this deeply taboo.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think that's the source of a lot of her sort of hesitation and sometimes her unwillingness to look at hard things head on.
Mm-hmm. She's a great character and
Thank you.
really anchors the book in a lot of ways. Um, and it's interesting. As somebody who I'm Jewish culturally, I don't really practice, but I really appreciate your words on that. My next novel next year is the most Jewish thing I'll ever write. I'm just gonna leave it at that.
I can't wait.
It's coming from Clash Books next year, but and I can't talk about the title yet. I'm really excited about it. Um, but anyways, so the thing about okay, so Beth as a character. Now you developed a lot of these characters in your head a long time before you started writing, or did they kind of come as you were writing them? And
They
in
popped
relation,
out as I was writing.
okay. So
I
tell me
don't
about Beth.
have uh so Beth is much more based on trans women who look like me and who live like me. And Beth comes from where I come from. She's a fairly poor kid from New Hampshire. She's from a home that is intermittently difficult in different ways, and she's very accustomed to being kicked around and singled out. Um, and what I wanted to do with Beth is take this sort of foil to Fran and vice versa, that you have this woman who has all the same feelings that Fran does, but cannot escape her body, has no road to resolving these issues aside from changing the way that she thinks about herself. And even that will not change the way the world treats her. It won't make her safer to be confident or whatever. Um, and she's also paradoxically at various points in the novel valued for her more traditionally masculine traits, for her ability to use a bow, for the fact that she has a penis. Um, and so Beth is forced to live in this sort of dual role that she does not want to occupy. She's never allowed to be delicate or feminine.
Well, and it's very specific to the novel that like the situation she's put in where her attributes and her traits, you know, so that's one of the reasons why Beth is such an important character to the book because unlike Fran who, you know, could more or less, I guess, I don't know what the pass, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then Beth has a situation where all of a sudden she's valued for the bow and for the penis and this stuff like that, and then it becomes like something that. And first of all, those are all moments too that starting the book, I wasn't expecting, or and were really poignant and important because they were aspects of her character that really makes the reader think about Beth and her position and what she has to go through. So I think part of the heart and soul of the book as well. So
Thank you. Yeah.
yeah. Now the same case, Ravi is a character that when Ravi's introduced and he's got a very specific role in the book too because at the same time is a survivor in a world where most men are feral, and then has the contradictory moments with his cycle and those kinds of things, which are really important parts to the book as well. Can you tell me about developing Ravi as a character? Because I think Ravi is so very important to this book.
Thank you. I think so too. Um, I would say that Ravi has probably the most straightforward genesis of any of these characters, in that he is a synthesis of the many trans men that I know and love, who have been my friends and my family and my lovers for as long as I've been out. And I wanted those people who matter so much to me to see themselves in this world and to see themselves as this heroic figure who, even though he struggles to connect to others and he struggles to feel like he deserves to exist in the world, he has this incredible reservoir of bravery inside him, and also has a real moral compass.
Right.
And he's also one of the clearest sighted people in the novel. It's Ravi who sort of intuits how Beth wants to be treated. It's Ravi who sees what's going on in the bunker when Fran refuses to.
Yeah. Well, Robbie, the bravery aspect of robbery of Robbie, robbery, Robbie, uh, uh, is a really important characteristic too, because once the communities start kind of getting challenged and those things, the dynamic between Robbie and especially Beth, I think, really plays a huge role for how things move forward. And it's really, Robbie's so important to the story as well, you know. So I have two more things, and then I know you have a thing to get to tonight, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. But this has been awesome. I really appreciated also, and you kind of mentioned this already, but the sexuality in the book is really important for visibility and normalizing the spectrum of sexuality that exists in it is really, really important. I think for me as a cisgendered, pretty normal, average guy, for me, the first time I read about gay sex was in a horror novel, right? And the first time that I got the chance to kind of look at it and be like, okay, that's normal and that's fine. Like, the first time I read in a Poppy Bright book, what was was happening, then said to myself, okay, I'm okay with that, and then moved on. I think in a lot of ways, I think for a lot of horror readers who are mainstream horror readers, this is going to be their first experience with transsexuality. So I think you probably felt a lot of responsibility for that, towards that in the writing of this book. I'm assuming, right?
I actually felt none at all.
None. It was just natural for you, and you just did it.
The sex in this book is for me, and it's for trans people. And if straight and cis people take something away from it, that's great. But I don't care.
You don't care. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's great. That's fine too. But I mean, I have to look at it as a cisgender reader, right? So.
Yeah, and I'm thrilled that it meant something to you.
Yeah, no, because it's something that, I was excited. My first thought was, kudos to Tor that they didn't make you tone any of that down or do any of that, and I really appreciated that. So, and I think, whereas you just wrote for yourself and you don't care, I do think it's going to be important visibility for readers who are.
That would be lovely if it were.
Yeah. Or it should be. And I know there's going to be haters and there's going to be assholes, but, fuck them. So, the other thing, too, is the communities in the book are really important. Like, the various different communities that come up after this gender apocalypse. And that's the last thing that I really wanted to talk about, because a huge theme for me in reading Manhunt was I had the thought to myself because I recently reread Screwfly Solution, because I recently reread Tiptree's collection and reviewed it like a year and a half ago. And one of the things that I was reminded of when I read that is that she had an eye for that communities would totally change and totally be different if women were in charge and doing things. And so going into Manhunt, I thought, how is she going to deal with these communities? Because communities are going to pop up in different ways, because I think women tend to be a little bit more collective. But there's also the challenges of when you try to do that in the real world, right?
Right.
So, and get into personalities. And then, so how did you approach these communities and writing this book? Because I think that's so important to this book.
Well, I approached them from a couple of angles. First, you have the TERFs, who have this sort of military society that's based all around seniority and sort of ideological rigidity, but that has a very sort of hoorah Marine side. You know, they're getting drunk and getting tattoos together and celebrating successful death squad trips. Um, and for that, I mean, I've read Kershaw. I'm pretty well versed in what it's like when Nazis hang out with each other, and I've also done a lot of research on TERFs and on all of the various groups that have come together to form that sort of amorphous, politically incoherent blob in the modern era, which is, of course, everything from actual radical feminists to like paranoid anti-vaxxer stay-at-home moms and even the rabid evangelical right wing.
And they should realize that what you're depicting is how the trans community feels about them, regardless of what their intentions are. You know, the metaphor in the novel is how the community feels about them, and they should take a second to recognize that, at least in my opinion.
Well, I won't hold my breath for that.
Yes. Well, yes, I hear you on that. But so the communities. I'm sorry, I interrupted. Yeah.
No, no worries. I would say the other biggest thing last night, my sweetheart and I were watching The Boys in the Band, the very famous sort of first American mainstream gay movie, which was adapted from a play of the same name. And it's about this horrible birthday party thrown by one New York gay guy for his boyfriend in the 70s. And it's just before AIDS. And it's these people who are only together because they have the same sexuality, because they're rejects and no one else will have them. And they've been together for so long, and they've been in so many different relationship configurations and seen so many stages in one another's lives. They all know each other so well. And it's beautiful, but it's also a total nightmare.
Right.
And that's certainly a part of Manhunt, you know, even right down to the relationship between Fran and Beth, who are lifelong friends, who are very different people, and when they had the option, stopped being friends. And now circumstances force them back together because there's safety in numbers. And so you have these very complicated social dynamics full of people who are together because they can't be anywhere else, because the world isn't safe for them. And that can be a beautiful thing, and it can be a really fucking irritating thing.
Right.
And then I would say that the third leg of the tripod of communities within the books is the bunker and the kind of suburban complacency that it represents, where you just offload any difficult decision to people who are overinvested with power and authority, and who can take the moral weight of all these rotten ways of keeping the world running away from you, so that you can pretend that there's nothing you can do about it. Like, oh, they're exploiting defenseless workers, and they're not letting brown people in, and everything is so awful, and the supplies of medicine and food and water are all rigidly controlled. But it's not my fault because I'm not in charge. So to my mind, the bunker is really liberalism. It's sort of electoral politics and modern America.
Yeah, that's great. No, and I think it works. A lot of people are going to focus on the testicle eating and all that stuff, and but this reader, really liked the characters and really think that Manhunt sings because of the fresh perspective and the characters and how it really, as the dude would say, ties the room together. And I think, if the characters were not strong in this book, it wouldn't work the way that it does. And I think most readers aren't even going to notice, how strong. And a lot of it, they're going to be so swept up in the story that, you know, that the characters are going to be rich in a way that happens so naturally. That's one of the things too about like when Stephen King writes characters. A lot of times you don't see the things he's doing with the characters because it happens so naturally.
Yeah, he's very deft at bringing you to a place where you feel you know someone in just a few lines.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, and I want to say specifically, Ravi is a character who I know very well. Um, uh, a friend in my life transitioned to male, and I happened to just be that be his roommate on the night when the call to the parents and coming out happened, and I was in the room for it. And specifically, Ravi was somebody I knew. So, and I just, want to say that Ravi's a person I know. So, and a character that I really related to and really found to be really important to the book. So, on that note, I want everyone out there, if you made it this far and you're listening, like Manhunt is a book that deserves our support. Really look for ways to. I think people should look for ways to. We know there's a lot of haters out there attacking you, and we should be looking for ways to support Gretchen in this book. And the most important way you can do it is by reading it. And this was an interview that a lot of times I get down into real serious spoilers, and I didn't want to do that this time because I wanted to keep some of the things about the way the story unfolds out there because I really want to. This is a case of where I'm more interested in selling books than breaking down the book for a small group of people who have already read it. And in that regard, if you have not read Manhunt yet, go out there, get it. Request it at your library is something I think is really important.
I agree. That's my preference is libraries and local bookstores.
I got it from the library. I requested it myself. I have a good relationship with my librarian. I've requested a lot of books, and I'm the reason why that cover is sitting in the library in San Diego. And I appreciate everyone who has supported this book already and will in the future. Gretchen, any last words for my listeners about Manhunt and what you're doing in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess if I were to pick one thing to sign off with, it would be if you found Manhunt gross, you better fucking buckle up for the next one. I just turned in the first draft of The Cuckoo, which is a conversion therapy horror story.
Wow.
And I am starting on Mommy, my third novel, right now.
Wow. Now, you've teased Cuckoo on Twitter, and I knew of that, and I did not know what it was about, but I did hear you say buckle up before for that one, and I I am looking forward to it. Um, Gretchen, this was great. I love Manhunt. It's a great book.
Thank you so much, David. And thanks for having me on.
Yeah, yeah, no, I really appreciate it. Sorry if I talked a lot. I think
Oh, no worries.
a lot of times when I get into a book, like I get real excited about, like, oh my God, I got to talk about all this aspect. But I really, 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 really appreciate the characters in this book. I think they're fantastic.
That
And
means a lot to me.
yeah, and I really hope everyone gets behind it. And Gretchen, where can they find you online?
I am on Twitter at Scumbelievable. and I am on Patreon under my own name, Gretchen Felker-Martin.
Awesome. Thank you for your time, and we'll definitely want to have you back with the next book. I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm gonna dig into your historical horror. I think I love historical horrors. So,
I hope you enjoy it.
well, do you have a theory on why it's better in prose than on film? I think on film you're looking at everything to try and see stuff, or
Well, I
I don't
don't
know.
know. I'm a big fan of The Witch. I really enjoy The Devils, like I said earlier. So I don't know that I have
You don't have
the
the same
same
hang up as me on that.
set of inclinations. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, folks, check Gretchen's work out, and thank you for joining us on Postcards from a Dying World. See ya.